Welcome to today's class as we continue our study in the book of Galatians. We are in chapter 3, and today we start in verse 10 as the Apostle Paul is discussing with the Galatians what it truly means to be in this new covenant relationship. So we start straight away in verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them. Paul says here, for as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. You know, this is a very strong statement for the Apostle Paul to make, because he's talking, countering directly Jewish so-called believers who are attempting to drag the entire church of the Galatians back into the law of Moses. They are attempting to persuade everybody, to cajole everybody to leave grace and enter back into legalism. And what they're basically doing is attempting to drag everyone back into the works of the law. What are the works of the law? We talked about this at the beginning, that the works of the law is anything that you're trying to do in order to please God, anything you're trying to do in order to be accepted by God, anything you're trying to do in order to so-called obey the law of Moses qualifies as a work of the law. Law keeping, performing something. It can be prayer, it can be giving, it can be fasting, it can be serving, it can be all sorts of things that we do in order to try to please God and to be accepted by God. And so Paul makes this really radical statement when he says, for as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. That is extremely offensive to these, would be extremely offensive to these Jews, because they are under the works of the law. They are trying to obey the law. They've been trying to do that their entire life. And Paul is basically pronouncing them under a curse. He's saying anybody that gets under the works of the law is under a curse automatically. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. You know, this is really strong. Sometimes when we read this, we never pay attention we never really look at it keenly. But when you do, you realize this is such a strong statement to say that if anybody, and this is not just unique to these Jews, but anybody, Christian, if you are trying to obey the law in order to be righteous, you are under a curse. If you are doing anything, trying to do anything in order to please God, you are under a curse. If you are doing anything, if you're praying so that God will be pleased with you, if you're fasting so that God will make you righteous, if you're doing something in order to be holy, Paul says here, you are under a curse. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. Why? He says, because it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them. Paul is quoting Deuteronomy 27:26 is where it says that cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform. That's amazing, because if you understand Paul's logic, it's, first of all, when it says all things, it means all things which are written in the book of the law. There are 613 commands. Listen, there are 613 commands in the book of the law in Torah, from Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. There are 613 laws that are written for us to obey. Paul here quotes Deuteronomy 27:26, where God said, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all these things written in the book of the law to do them. Now, Paul's logic is very interesting here, because Paul is saying that if you choose to be under the law, if you choose to live in the law, if you insist that you want to live by the commandments of God, then automatically you are cursed. Why? Because When God was giving the law, this is what God said. Deuteronomy 27:26. God said this: if anyone does not obey everything in this law, they are cursed. Let's say that again. If you choose to live in the law, if you choose that you're going to obey the law in order to please God, you automatically come under a curse. Why? Because when God was giving the law, this is what God said, Deuteronomy 27:26. God said this: if anyone does not obey all of the law, 100%, every single law, there are 613, remember. If anyone does not obey all the 613 laws, they are under my curse. That's what God did. God cursed anybody who was living in the law who did not perform it 100%. If you did 99%, you came under the curse. If you did 99.9%, you came under the curse. God only wanted 100%. And this always amazes me. I enjoy having this discussion with especially people who are insistent on us living under the law and obeying the commandments. I like having that conversation with them because they never realize this. And if you're listening to me and you're one of these people, this is something you've never realized. That when God was giving the law, God said that anybody who does not obey all of the law is under the curse. That's what God said. God said if you don't obey it fully, 100%, you are cursed. That's what God said. And God does not lie. So I have never met a single person who has obeyed all of the 613 regulations and rules and laws from from Exodus to Deuteronomy to Numbers to Leviticus. I've never met a person like that who obeys all of them 100%. The 613, I've never, and you've never, and there has never been a single person to do it except Jesus. Jesus was the first to obey all of them. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. So everybody else who brings themselves under the law does not realize that they have already entered into the curse. They are now cursed. Why? Because you are breaking them every single day. Do you know how many laws you are breaking on a daily basis? There are so many laws. It's not just the 10 Commandments, but most people break the 10 Commandments daily. Just the 10. You break them all the time, but they are more than 10. Those are the commandments. We know the 10 that were written on the tablets of stone. But there's another 600 that were not written on the tablets that Moses brought, but that God gave. You read Deuteronomy and read Numbers, and you see God give Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, and even Exodus. You read, and then you see God adding regulations about how they are supposed to cook, what kind of food they're supposed to eat, what they're not supposed to eat, how they're supposed to dress. Did you know, for example, that just dressing in a mixed a cloth with multiple different materials was considered a breaking of God's regulations? It was considered unclean. You couldn't do that. If you had a stooped shoulder, that was considered unclean. If you had eyes that had problems with your eyes, that was considered unclean. If you had flat feet, that was considered unclean. There's lots of things that were considered unclean in the old covenant, that in the law and in the rituals. There were all kinds of regulations about all kinds of things, all kinds of laws that God gave to Israel. And God said, if you fail in any of these, you are under the curse. In fact, James comes and says that if you obey the whole law and yet offend in one, you are guilty of breaking all of it. That's what James says. That if you obey all of the law, and yet you offend in one point, you are guilty of breaking it all. So in other words, if you obey all of the law, but your only weakness is that you are a thief, then you're guilty of breaking all of it. You're not just a thief, but you're also a murderer. You're also an adulterer. You are also all of these other things because you've broken one. This is the seriousness of the law. He says, who abides not in all things which are written in the book of the law. He said in the book of the law, that is Torah, the five books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He said, if you don't obey all of these ones, you are finished. You are under the curse. So you need to turn to your neighbor who's always talking about obeying the law and ask them, are you obeying all of them 100%? Those of you that insist on obeying the law, are you obeying it 100%? The 613. Most Christians cannot even tell you the 10 commandments. That's a challenge for you. Can you tell me the 10 commandments in order? Most people can't. And you find somebody who is fighting for the law and they're ready to die for the law. And you ask them, okay, tell me the 10 commandments. Just tell me the 10 commandments and where they are found in the Bible. And they'll be like, love your father and mother, do not steal, worship God, don't commit adultery, and they're done. Verse 11. Now that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God or before God, it is evident, for the righteous man shall live by faith. Now, Paul flows into this. He says, first of all, that if you come under the law, you are automatically cast. And then he follows that up by saying, the fact that no one is made right by obeying the law, by fulfilling the law, that much is obvious to anybody who has paid attention. If you've tried to pay attention, the problem with Christians is like usually when we leave our brains outside. And when we enter the church, we leave the brains outside. We don't think critically about these things. But seriously, think about it this way. If a person is preaching the law, or if a person is insisting that we must obey the law, they haven't thought critically. Because first of all, nobody obeys the law 100%. So which means that if it is true that we must live under the law to please God, there's not a single human being who's pleasing God. If it's true that we must obey the law to go to heaven, there's not a single person who is in heaven, because there's not a single person who obeyed the law to please God except Jesus. Everybody else is disqualified because the law disqualifies everybody. It says here that no one is justified by the law in God's sight. It is evident. It is obvious. In fact, he had even mentioned that earlier. But if you look at Romans 3:20, he tells us that nobody can be declared righteous. Romans 3:20. Nobody can be declared righteous in God's sight by obeying the law. It's impossible to be made righteous by obeying the by by the obedience of the law shall no flesh be justified. It's not possible. It's not possible. That's Romans 3:20. It's not possible to be considered righteous by obeying the law. In fact, if you read, we read this in Galatians 2, in verse 21, and then it says that if righteousness comes by the law, then Christ died in vain. If you can be right, if you can be justified before God by obeying the law, then Jesus died for nothing. But it says it is evident, it is obvious that there's not a single person who has ever pleased God by obeying the law. All the people in the Old Testament who pleased God and whom God said that he was pleased with, there is not a single one of them that was obeying the law for God to say that about them. Say that again loudly. Listen, go and read the Old Testament. There are people that God said he was pleased with. There is not a single one of them that he said he was pleased because they had obeyed the law. Not a single one. He was pleased with Job. He was pleased with Moses. He was pleased with Abraham. In fact, he called Abraham his friend. And none of them God was pleased with because they were obeying the law. He said David was a man after his own heart, and David was one of the biggest lawbreakers we've ever seen. Do you know David did three things that were worthy of death, and yet God spared him? Three things. One, he refused to go to war during a time of war. He stayed home and slept. Two, he committed adultery with Bathsheba. In that same vein, three, he killed Bathsheba's husband plus other soldiers, his mighty men who were loyal to him. He killed them to cover up his sin with Bathsheba. Obviously, he took her. I don't think it was willing because he was the king and she was married and she loved her husband. So, but he abused power. He did all of this stuff. God did not kill him. God did not even do anything to him. And that just it confounds us. Moses was the chief lawbreaker. Do you know that Moses was the first person in history to break the law? Moses came with the law. He saw these people sinning and he dropped the tablets and he broke all the 10 laws at once. If you've not got that one, you'll get it later. But Moses broke all the law at once. He was the first person to break the law. I'm jesting, of course, but on a serious note, that it is obvious through history. It is obvious in the Old Testament. There's not a single person that was ever justified, that was ever accepted, that has ever made righteous before God by obeying the law. Paul is saying that much is obvious. You're not going to be the first one. You need to turn to your neighbor and tell them you're not going to be the first one to please God by obeying the law. And then he says here, but the just or the righteous shall live by faith. It's obvious that now this the just shall live by faith is not a command. He's not saying that the just should go and live by faith. The word of faith has interpreted it this way. Not general word of faith, but most people who claim to live a faith life, they quote this and claim that we who are righteous, we shall live by faith. We have to walk by faith. No, that's not what he's saying. If you read it in context, the context is contrasting living under the law and living in faith. In other words, that there are people who live under the law who are living under a curse because they are failing to fulfill they are breaking the law. But then there is us who are righteous, who have been saved, who have been born again, who have believed. And for us, we are the just, we are the righteous. And we live by simply believing. We don't live by doing. We live by believing. We don't live by obeying the law. We live simply by faithing, by believing, by trusting in the finished work of Jesus on the cross. We are not attempting to do stuff in order for God to be pleased with us and to love us and to be good to us. We simply believe what God has said about us. We simply believe what Jesus has done for us on the cross. We simply believe what the finished work of Jesus is. We are righteous and we live in this righteousness by simply believing. We are the just who live by faith. We live by believing. We don't live by doing. We don't live by praying and fasting and confessing and breaking and studying and serving. We live by simply believing. We are right, we are just. And what God has called us to, we simply respond to Him in faith by believing Him. We are not attempting to do stuff for God in order to be justified. We are justified already. And so we live by simply believing the fact that Jesus has already justified us. We live by believing that Jesus has washed us, that we have been forgiven, that we have been sanctified, that we have been made right and holy, that we are pleasing to God, that we are acceptable to God, that we are His beloved child in whom He is well pleased, that we are the apple of His eye, that we are close to Him, that we are one with Him. We live this way, that God loves us, that God likes us, that God is pleased with us. We simply believe this, and we live by simply believing this. That's who the just is. We live by simply believing. Then it goes to verse 12. However, the law is not of faith. On the contrary, he who practices them shall live by them. He's saying, for us, we simply live by believing. They just live by believing, by faith. However, the law is not of faith. That's why they just don't live by the law. Because the law does not require you to believe. The law requires you to perform. Faith requires us to simply believe and trust God. The law requires us to do something. It requires you to pray a certain number of times a day. It requires you to fast a certain way. It requires you to eat a certain way, to dress a certain way, to talk a certain way. The law requires you to perform, to do something in order for God to be pleased with you. But for us who are just, we live in a different covenant where we simply believe. First, we live by simply believing. You get that? So this just shall live by faith is not saying that the just should charge faith and you should all the time be trying to live by faith, receive everything by faith, take everything by faith. No, that's what it's saying. It's not giving you a lot to do. It's telling you that this is how you actually live every day, by simply believing. All you do is believe. It's how you came in. It's how you became just, by simply believing. It's how you stay in, by simply believing. On the contrary, he says the law is not of faith. For it is written, he who practices them, he who does them, shall live by them. In other words, that is Leviticus 18:5. He's saying that the law is not for believing. The law is for performing, that you do something, you get something. You do something, you get something. You obey these laws, God blesses you. You fail to obey them, God punishes you. That's the law. It has nothing to do with faith. It's about performing, doing something, earning something. And have you noticed that I repeat myself a lot? I've told you before that that's deliberate. It's not that I don't have what to say. I have so much to say, but the reason I go again and again and again in circles is because this stuff has to be said again and again and again for it to sink in the heart of Christians. Most of us have been conditioned to do things to please God. We've been conditioned to pray, to go to church, to give, to fast, to serve in order for God to be pleased with us. And so I have to go again and again and try to uproot that and break that foundation and make you realize that you don't have to do a single thing. You are right by believing. They just live by faith. They just live by believing, not by working, not by doing things. They are not made righteous by doing things. The righteous stay in this place of pleasing God simply by believing. We don't do anything, we just believe. And John said, we have known and believed the love that the Father has toward us. That's all we do. We just know and believe. All the time, we just believe. Are you saying that believing is enough? Yes, that's what I'm saying. Are you saying that I don't have to go to church another day of my life? Yes, I'm saying you don't have to go to church another day of your life. You don't have to. You go because you want to. You go because you love God and you love the brethren. You go because you enjoy it. You go because it's good for you to go. You go because it's beneficial for you to go. But you don't go because you have to, you must, or God will be displeased. No, 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 no. God will not be displeased with you if you don't go. But you'll be foolish not to. Are you saying I don't have to pray? You don't have to pray. You don't have to. You get to. You pray because you're right, because you're righteous, because you're a child of God, and you want to communicate with your Father and with your darling Lord Jesus and with Holy Spirit. You pray because of that. You don't, it's not a must that you must do that. Listen, let me make a controversial statement here. There is no must in the new covenant. There is nothing that we must do. Everything we get to do because of who we are. This is the fundamental difference between the old and the new. We don't have anything we must do. You don't have to fast. You don't have to give. You don't have to tithe. By the way, tithe is the new law. You don't have to pray. You don't have to be baptized. You don't have to. You get to. You do it because it is good. You do it because it is right. You do it because it's the correct thing to do. You do it because it is the righteous thing to do. Because it's your nature now to do it. Amen. But it's not because it's a law that God is going to punish you for not doing. We are not like that anymore. We live by believing. We simply believe. We are made right by simply believing. We are maintained in righteousness and rightness by simply believing. Glory be to God. That's very good. Now, in the next verse, we're going to touch something hot. So I will reserve that for the next class. Thank you for studying with me. You are blessed. By the way, if you're struggling with some of the things I'm saying, I'd say, what about this verse? What about this verse? Don't worry. This is going to be, the challenge with this is that because of the time we have, we cannot cover everything at once. Yeah, but as we go through, we shall answer a lot of those whatabouts. And again, the platforms are open. You can get in touch and ask a question, and then I'll be able to deal with that. I know there are lots of whatabouts. What about this? What about here? What about there? We will deal with all of that, but we can't do everything at once. But in due time, we will cover all of the bases and answer all of those pertinent questions. So thank you for watching with me and studying with me. You are blessed with all blessings. Kari Shalom.